In the spring of 1976, folk singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot entered the studio with a lot on his mind. Over the course of 5 days, he and his band assembled to record the entirety of his next album, but one song in particular he refused to play. He said it wasn't ready yet, and he wouldn't be able to get it ready in time to release on the album. His bandmates had not heard the song yet and only knew that it was something about a shipwreck. After finishing the recording early, the studio engineer pushed for Lightfoot to take advantage of the studio time and assembled band to just try the song out. They rolled on a take and he played The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald in its totality for its first audience. The other band members jumped in on his cues and largely improvised their way through the song. For most people today, this song is the reason that they know of the Edmund Fitzgerald. However, when Lightfoot began writing the song, barely a month had passed since this Great Lakes freighter had been lost. To him, it was personal. He was an Ontario native who had spent a great deal of his life on and around the Great Lakes. On the night the Fitzgerald sank, Lightfoot had sat in his Toronto home, remarking on the same terrible storm, "I wonder what it's like up on Lake Superior." After reading what had happened to the Fitzgerald, Lightfoot was deeply moved and felt like he knew what his next song would be about. Today we'll discuss the history of not just the Edmund Fitzgerald, but the history of the region, the circumstances in which she operated, and the impact of her final tragic voyage. To fully understand the context of the tale of the Edmund Fitzgerald, it would be helpful to start far back in the past. So please, allow me to indulge, and I hope it will help you to fully understand just how we got here. First, the formation of the Great Lakes. Beginning 120,000 years ago, huge swaths of our planet were encased in a vast crust of ice, in some places over 3 to 4 kilometers or nearly 2.5 miles thick. For 100 millennia, the ice fields grew and waned in a period that we call the last glacial period, or the Ice Age. The Earth at this time was a very different looking place, with coastlines that only somewhat resemble those of today due to significantly lower sea levels. Beneath those receding and advancing glacial sheets, the land underneath was changing greatly too. On the landmass that we now call North America, a mile-thick glacier called the Laurentide ice sheet covered most of Canada and the northern United States. It grew and shrank many times over that 100,000-year period, and underneath its immense weight, it carved great basins into the land beneath. Between 20 and 12,000 years ago, the Earth began a gradual period of warming that caused the sheets to recede for the last time, uncovering their hidden handiwork. As those glaciers melted, the water filled those massive basins, creating the earliest form of the bodies of water that we now refer to as the Great Lakes. They continued to shift and change over the next millennia until about 3,000 years ago when they reached their current familiar shape. Today, there are 5 large bodies of water that form this massive system of lakes: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and the largest of them all, Superior. To those who haven't seen them before, the name doesn't quite relate the true magnitude of the Great Lakes. While technically true, the word lake is deceptive. It would perhaps be more useful to think of the Great Lakes as being closer to inland seas than most people's traditional conception of a lake. At their widest points, it is impossible to see the other side from the lakeshore. At its deepest point, Lake Superior could submerge every floor of the Empire State Building. These lakes hold approximately 20% of the Earth's freshwater supply and 90% of the US's. For as long as these lakes have existed, generations of people have lived by and relied upon them. Circa 1600, there were approximately 20 native tribes that lived on these lakes and depended on them for their way of life. Lake Superior had several names, but to the Ojibwe people, also known as the Chippewa, it was known as Gitchigumi, which roughly translates to Big Sea or Huge Water. No one is sure exactly when the European colonists first made contact with the tribes of the Great Lakes. Jacques Cartier of France first explored the region between 1534 and 1542, as he traveled down the St. Lawrence River attempting to establish a French colony. While his journey up the river never actually reached the Great Lakes, it paved the way for further exploration and the eventual founding of Quebec City by Samuel de Champlain in 1608. De Champlain was an expert cartographer, and his voyages offer us the first European maps of the Great Lakes themselves. The founding of Quebec prompted the first real relations between France and the native tribes. Along with Dutch and English colonies in the region, these arriving European powers had a hunger for the continent's largely unspoiled land and untapped resources, and commenced many trade relations with the native peoples for trapped furs. This lucrative business prompted a long stretch of war and violence between the tribes, backed by feuding European powers, wiping out many and displacing many others in what would be called the French and Indian Wars. While those native tribes would continue being forced out over the centuries, the young cities of the Great Lakes wouldn't see explosive growth until the latter half of the 19th century. For our story, which I promise we'll get to the Edmund Fitzgerald soon, we will focus on Lake Superior. The Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad finished construction in 1870, linking the burgeoning lakeside city of Duluth to St. Paul, which was at the head of the Mississippi River. This link caused industrial activity to explode in the region, as this river connected them directly to the eastern half of the United States. In 1869, there were 14 families in Duluth. Only 7 months later, there were 3,500 people. The lake supported large fishing industries, and the surrounding woodland birthed a thriving lumber business, but soon it would be iron that would dominate the region. At first, iron would be a very modest segment of the Great Lakes economy, but as the nation rapidly industrialized, it would explode in size. By the start of the 20th century, the region would be responsible for 3/4 of the U.S. iron supply. This was largely thanks to the first industrial refinement of taconite. Previously, iron could really only be sourced from high-quality deposits, and the marble-sized nuggets of taconite ore were essentially an unusable waste product. The quality was low, and only about 20 to 30% of its mass was true iron ore. Prompted by the explosive demand for iron during the Second World War, researchers out of the University of Minnesota found a reliable way to extract iron from the taconite, and a new major industry was born. Whole cities and towns popped up along the lake, solely dedicated to extracting and refining this ore. The lake shifted to become major high-traffic shipping lanes for this product, and the ships that hauled them grew bigger and faster with each passing year. Thus enters... Given the region's heavy involvement in the iron trade, it was common for seemingly unrelated companies to be heavily invested in those industries. The major growth here necessitated bigger and bigger ships be built all the time to shift as much product as possible. One company, Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, commissioned Great Lakes Engineering Works to build a new iron freighter the likes of which the region had never seen. It would be the biggest ship ever to embark on the lakes, and it was nearly as big as was even allowed. At 75 feet wide and 729 feet long, it was only 1 foot shorter than the absolute limit allowed by the Sault Ste. Marie locks. In many ways, it would be the most impressive lake-bound ship of its time. It would cost a record-breaking $8.4 million, the most ever spent on a freighter at the time. It could haul 26,000 tons of ore in a voyage and move at a brisk top speed of 16 miles per hour. It would be built using innovative new techniques, wherein separate prefabricated segments could be floated together and assembled with cranes. Construction began in August of 1957, and it would be completed 10 months later. The ship would bear the name of Northwestern Mutual CEO Edmund Fitzgerald. Although insurance may have been his trade, Edmund came from a long line of sailors and shipbuilders. Both his father, John, and grandfather, William, had ships named after them. After construction was completed, the ship was launched on June 7, 1958, to huge fanfare. Again, it can't be understated how much these ships and the industry surrounding them were precious to the culture around the lakes. Over 10,000 people were in attendance at its launch day, with spectators crowded onto specially constructed bleachers and the decks of other nearby ships, and not just locals, but prominent politicians and businessmen from around the state too. Despite the impressive attendance, the event went far from smoothly. Mr. Edmund Fitzgerald's wife was selected to christen the ship, and upon striking the hull with the ceremonial champagne, it bounced away rather than shattering. This is already a bad omen for a ship, only made more prescient by the fact that it bounced off a second time, only shattering on the third strike. From there, when the boat was finally launched, it slid into the water at an awkward angle that created a massive wave that soaked much of the crowd. It rocked and rolled so much in the water that the ship actually struck the dock on its far side. Reportedly, there was one 58-year-old man in attendance, who had traveled hours from faraway Toledo, who was so overcome by the excitement of it all that he had a heart attack and died. Needless to say, this cast a bit of a black shadow over the ship that we can really only see with hindsight. The ship was designed for an approximately 50-year lifespan on the water, and while it wouldn't last that long, it would certainly leave a mark during its tenure. After finishing construction, it was leased to the Columbia Transportation Division fleet of Oakle Bay Norton, where it would serve as their flagship. For years, it broke many records for cargo load size, annual tonnage, and overall speed. Over its life, the ship was continually upgraded with things like additional thrusters and an oil-powered boiler to replace their coal-fired furnaces, which were done to keep it at the top of the line. In addition, its many successes are partially attributable to the ship's very seasoned crew, who flocked to it for its modern and comfortable design. Rooms were equipped with air conditioning, had decent furniture, had hot running water, and even private showers in some of the officers' rooms. Then there was the lounge that had comfortable seating, coffee makers, and a TV set, large kitchen and 2 dining rooms, which really made the ship feel like a second home for the crew. And in return, the crew really loved the Fitzgerald and treated it like a home. They were known to play music through the ship's loudspeakers as they passed by nearby port towns, and gave whimsical commentaries to watchers on shore. All of these things endeared her to the locals. In 1972, command of the Fitzgerald was given to veteran sailor Ernest McSorley, who would serve as her fourth captain. McSorley had worked his way up through the ranks on a number of ships, and had captained several in the Columbia fleet, with each posting being more prestigious than the last. By all accounts, he was a hard-working man who was respected by his crew. The crew was of varying ages beneath them, but it would be hard to find a more capable crew. 5 of the 29 were in their 60s, and 12 were in their 50s. The chief engineer was only the second man to hold that position. Of course, sailors moved from ship to ship often, but the Fitzgerald was always in good hands. However, even the best sailors and the best ships can't always withstand what Mother Nature can throw their way. It was November 9th, 1975, and the Fitzgerald was harbored at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock in Superior, Wisconsin. It was nearing the end of her 18th season on the lake. Still, there was much more work to be done, and they would take advantage of every day of fair autumn weather to maximize loads delivered. The crew worked slowly and steadily that day to load the Fitzgerald's cargo hold with 26,116 tons of taconite ore. They took their time here, because although this whole process could take 6 hours to complete, doing it too fast could lead to disastrous results. First, it was important to ensure an even weight distribution in the cargo hold. If it was uneven, it could cause the ship to sag in the middle, bottom out in shallow waters, or even crack under the stress. While experienced crews worked to avoid this, any of these were known to happen, causing damage or even outright disaster. Even beyond weight distribution, there were other factors at play. If the taconite was loaded too quickly, the heavy ore could damage the cargo hatches during loading. Keeping a weather-tight seal was already impossible on those hatches, and damaging them only made it more difficult. Under bad weather, damaged hatches could flood, and the porous taconite could become exponentially heavier after taking on water. This weight could build up fast, meaning a heavily flooded compartment could easily sink the ship. This is all to say that the ore loading process was critical, and any mistakes could cost both the ship and their lives. In fact, the Fitzgerald cargo hatches had already been damaged earlier in the season. The ship was cleared for operation for the rest of the year as long as it was repaired in the off-season, but it made the importance of their task all the more clear. Loaded with taconite and over 50,000 gallons of oil, the Fitzgerald embarked at around 2 p.m., slated for a routine trip to Great Lakes Steel on Zug Island, a processing plant near Detroit. Shortly after, the Fitzgerald was joined on the water by the SS Arthur M. Anderson, another well-respected cargo ship, captained by 38-year sailing veteran Jesse Cooper. At the time of their departure, a heavy storm was forecast on the lake, but neither captain was worried about it yet. Even still, it was comforting to have another ship nearby, just in case. For a while, it seemed like the growing storm might miss Lake Superior, but over time it became clear that it was going to hit. Both ships were weather reporting vessels, fitted with a wide array of sensors and equipment that reported happenings to the National Weather Service. As the storm built, the captains grew concerned over the 40-plus mile-per-hour winds. If the storm carried on into the next day with those wind speeds, it could create some massive waves. Still, it was nothing that either captain had never experienced before, and there wasn't need to worry just yet. They believed that they would be sheltered from the worst of the storm when they passed south of Isle Royale, acting as a shield of sorts. And besides, time was money on the lakes, and neither felt it necessary to divert course for slower and safer waters. McSorley was known for his skill in handling storms, and he always stayed on schedule. With the advances in weather tracking technology, ships were also given more fair warning than ever before, but weather on the lakes could still change very quickly. Many other experienced sailors had been lost to storms on these waters. Some could reach hurricane-force speeds or produce waves over 3 stories tall. Ships could be sank or even tossed ashore if the weather was right. Despite the many dangers, captains were rewarded for bravery, or perhaps overconfidence in some cases, in facing these deadly storms. The Henry B. Smith was one great example of a ship that was lost to this business maxim. The captain was reluctant to sail in inclement weather, but under threat of termination, he set sail and the ship was sank along with all 25 of her crew. While captains were the masters of their vessels, they were still beholden to forces above them, whether it be capital or Mother Nature herself. By the evening of the 9th, the Fitzgerald was starting to run into that inclement weather, but not enough to cause concern. The two ships were already sailing along at a steady 15 knots, and the Fitzgerald expected to pass the Anderson soon enough. As long as all went according to plan, they would pass Isle Royale in the dead of night when most of the crew would be asleep. No need yet for alarm. By 1 a.m. on November 10th, the storm had grown in strength quite considerably. What the National Weather Service had previously categorized as a gale warning had now escalated into a full-blown storm. The Fitzgerald's weather report at the time places her about 20 miles south of Isle Royale. There, rain was very heavy and northeasterly winds were measured at 52 knots. Waves were 10 feet high and the temperature dropped to just 37 degrees. Visibility was down to 2 to 4 miles. Even still, neither captain was visibly worried. Huge quantities of water crashing onto the deck would be dangerous, but for now they still felt safe. Even still, weather on the lakes was known to change very rapidly due to the lake effect. Captains rarely had fair warning on the severity of storms, and even when they did, they couldn't know how accurate they would be or for how long. By 3 a.m., the Fitzgerald had passed the Anderson. Both captains had considered altering their course to get more protection from the Canadian shoreline, but neither ended up doing so. They had a schedule to keep, and the weather was not yet severe enough in their minds to make that call. They carried on under these conditions until 1 p.m. on the 10th, when the skies temporarily cleared as they entered the eye of the storm. In this moment of calm, they adjusted their plans and heading. The ships put a little extra distance between them for safety as they entered the most treacherous part of the voyage. Soon they would be passing a series of small islands and rocky shoals that were already difficult to navigate under clear weather. They knew the storm would resume as they got closer, creating a real risk of being knocked into the nearby rocks. The lake's depth also varied greatly in this area, quickly moving between depths as much as 600 feet to just 31 feet. This outcropping was known as the 6 Fathom Shoal. It and other rocky shoals had already claimed many ships in the past here, leaving their shredded remains as further obstacles for other ships. Even still, they pressed on, back into the storm. As they headed back towards the foreboding clouds ahead, the Edmund Fitzgerald would never see clear skies again. The Fitzgerald and the Anderson were built to take a beating, but no ship is indestructible. While these freighters are made of flexible steel and are designed to bend and bow with the waves, nature is often stronger than the best of human engineering, and this storm was pushing the Fitzgerald to her limits. In other severely stormy conditions, the ship could bow so much that if you were crawling through one of the lengthy service tunnels, the ends might rise so much that you could no longer see all the way to the end. It could roll so much in choppy waters, you might see sailors walking on the walls as much as the floor. The main factor at play here was the immense length of these ships. The Fitzgerald was 729 feet long, and like other Great Lakes freighters, its silhouette is defined by its lengthy, stretched midsection which held its cargo. It was designed this way to maximize load size, but rough weather could really do a number on these ships because of it. The water could be so rough that the bow or stern could lift entirely out of the water and be slammed back down. The propellers could be in the air, and the ship could bend so much that the rivets could fire out like bullets. That long midsection might buckle so much that the ship could fully fracture and maybe even tear in two. Years of this kind of abuse could be extremely rough on a ship, so even one that might pass an inspection could still have accumulated damage that could sink it if not addressed. This situation was not aided by, once again, the conflicting demands of safety, the whims of Mother Nature, and the capital driving it all. The shipping industry was growing a lot, especially in the 70s. Shipping seasons grew longer, ore loads increased in size, and technological advancements made captains and bosses bolder than ever before. While these factors may not always cause problems, when they did, the results could be catastrophic. The wind changed, and she was no longer even being afforded the minimal protection previously offered by the Canadian coastline. By late afternoon, she had passed Michipicoten Island and they were heading for Caribou Island, the home of the treacherous 6 Fathom Shoal. It was at this time that McSorley decided to diverge a bit from the Anderson. He would bring the Fitzgerald closer to the shoal, which would be a more direct and potentially quicker route. Quickly, things started to go south for the Fitzgerald. At 3:15 p.m., Captain Cooper the Anderson observed the Fitzgerald approaching Caribou Island and commented that she was closer than he would ever like to be. By 3:30 p.m., McSorley reported the Fitz had started taking damage. A fence rail had been knocked down, vents had been torn off, the ship was listing badly, and they were running both pumps to try to keep up with the water that they were taking on. He radioed to the Anderson and asked that they shadow the Fitz from a distance as they continued passing through the shoals. Meanwhile on land, the storm was absolutely devastating. 90-plus mile-per-hour winds easily uprooted trees, knocked over power lines, and sent debris flying. The Coast Guard shut down the Sioux locks and advised all ships to seek immediate shelter. The Anderson and Fitzgerald were hours away from anything that could offer even remotely appropriate protection. At 4:10, the Fitzgerald radios the Anderson for navigational aid for the rest of the voyage. They had lost both of their radars and were essentially sailing blind. This was about as bad of a place to lose radar as possible, and McSorley, for the first time, seemed genuinely concerned. The ships on the lakes radioed off one another, attempting to get a hold of the nearby Whitefish Point lighthouse, who could have theoretically given the Fitzgerald added navigational aid. They were unresponsive, however, because as the Coast Guard would later report, the lighthouse had lost power. During this time, Captain McSorley was briefly in contact with a Captain Woodward of the Avafor. Woodward stated that McSorley sounded unlike his usual calm self and seemed worried. During their call, he said it sounded like McSorley had shouted for a man to get off of the deck and to seek shelter. In a storm like that, these sailors would have known to stay off the decks unless they were dealing with an extreme emergency. He He told the Aberforth that the ship was taking on heavy water and that it was the worst seas he had ever experienced. From their position, the Anderson was able to pass by Caribou Island and the shoals with minimal trouble. By 7 p.m., the Fitzgerald was approximately 10 miles ahead and still reliant on the Anderson for radar reports. Cooper noticed that the Fitzgerald was listing left, riding very low in the water, and approaching another ship about 9 miles ahead. Simultaneously, they were being repeatedly hammered by 20 to 30-foot waves that were surely flooding an already waterlogged cargo compartment. He radioed to them, alerting them of the nearby ship, and it was during this call that anyone heard Captain McSorley's last known words. Anderson: "By the way, Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?" Fitzgerald: "We are holding our own." At 7:15, a squall passed over the Fitzgerald, concealing it from the Anderson's view and radars. By 7:30, the storm began to break slightly, but the Fitzgerald was still not in view. Captain Cooper radioed the nearest Coast Guard station and reported the situation, but they were too short on manpower and preoccupied searching for other smaller missing boats. They asked the Anderson to keep their eyes peeled for the Fitzgerald and to report back. If the worst had happened, Cooper knew that they wouldn't be of much help to the crew of the Fitz, if they were even able to find them. The seas were still extremely choppy and freezing cold. At 7:55, Cooper once again called the Coast Guard and reiterated that the Fitzgerald was still missing, but they were simply instructed for the time being to keep an eye out for a missing 16-foot vessel. Cooper continued periodic calls to the Coast Guard station and at 9, officially reported the Fitzgerald as missing. The Coast Guard station was understaffed and spread thin due to the storm, so they requested that the Anderson turn toward the Fitzgerald's last known location to search for survivors. At 10:30, the Coast Guard called out to the nearby Whitefish Bay and requested that all harbored ships assist in the search for the Fitzgerald. 2 vessels, the William Clay Ford and the Hilda Marianne, took the call, although the Marianne had to turn back since she was unable to weather the still heavy storm. At 10:53, the first Coast Guard aircraft arrived to search the lakes for the Fitzgerald. The William Clay Ford arrived to the last known location of the Fitzgerald by 2 a.m. on November 11th, and by that point, the grim reality of the situation loomed over the operation. That night, the Coast Guard issued an urgent broadcast for assistance to all ships on the lake that the Fitzgerald was missing. That broadcast continued until 10:12 on the 13th of November, when the active search was officially ended. Even still, the Coast Guard would do weekly flights over the area for the rest of the year. During the active search, 9 civilian ships would participate, from both the United States and Canada. Even as the search was carried out, on the morning of November 11th, Reverend Engel led the Mariners' Church in Detroit in prayer and held a memorial service for the 29 souls lost that night. During that search, no survivors were found and no bodies recovered. On November 11th, 1.5 lifeboats were found. Other discovered salvage included 2 inflatable life rafts, 21 life jackets or jacket pieces, and small pieces of miscellaneous debris and small items. Starting on November 14th, extensive underwater scans were done to try to locate the wreckage of the Fitzgerald, and several more scans would be conducted over the next several days and then the next few months, to make way for a visual confirmation dive. A remotely operated submarine vehicle, connected to the surface via an umbilical cord and power cable, was sent down to capture footage and photos of the ship. Between May 20th and the 28th, this submarine made 12 dives for a total of 56 hours underwater. They recorded over 43,000 feet of tape in this time and took 895 photographs. This is the final resting place of the Edmund Fitzgerald. She lies 530 feet under the lake's surface, split into 2 sections. The 276-foot-long bow section lay 170 feet away from the 253-foot stern, which had flipped upside down. The midsection lay strewn about in a field of twisted steel and debris, partially embedded into the lake's muddy floor. During their dives to the bottom, no bodies were found. While it is clear that the Edmund Fitzgerald was ultimately lost to the terrible storm that raged around her, the question remained: what exactly happened? There are several leading theories, each supported by different investigators and evidence. The 1977 Coast Guard report concluded that the ship's sinking was largely caused by ineffective and improperly sealed cargo hatch closures. As the ship was buffeted by crashing waves and rained upon for hours, they believed that the cargo hold had gradually filled with water over the course of her final voyage. Then it finally reached a critical point where buoyancy was lost and the ship could not recover after plunging into a large wave. This made the oar shift forward in the cargo hold, driving the ship down even faster. This conclusion was largely reached based upon the condition of the cargo hatches at the bottom of the lake. Most of the hatches were undamaged, and they believed that if they had been properly secured, they would show signs of warping. Since only a few hatches were damaged, this led them to believe that most hatches had not been properly secured during the voyage. The Lake Carriers Association disagreed with these findings, balking at the suggestion that a lack of proper care from the crew in sealing the hatch covers was responsible for the sinking. The head of the organization wrote to the National Transportation Safety Board to conduct their own investigation into the matter. They believed that a more likely answer was that the cargo area rapidly flooded after several of the hatches collapsed under the immense weight of the crashing seas. Even still, the Lake Carriers Association, which is an organization that advocates on behalf of U.S. lake shipping companies, postulated that the ship sank after running aground on the nearby 6-fathom shoal. Navigational reports from the Arthur M. Anderson did corroborate that the Fitzgerald sailed directly over one shallow reef. However, subsequent dives in the area did not show any signs of a recent collision. This hypothesis is heavily contested, with detractors saying the shipwreck does not show signs of a reef grounding either. Another theory is that the Fitzgerald's hull fractured in the center from the crashing waves and excessive hogging and twisting she experienced during the storm. The Coast Guard's report, however, asserts their belief that the Fitzgerald only broke in half after making contact with the lake floor. Still, several former members of the Fitzgerald believed this theory based on their experience with the ship's reportedly unusual buckling and bending in heavy storms. Others theorized that the ship's stern was driven deep into the water by a series of 3 rogue waves, nicknamed the Three Sisters. At the end of the day, nobody can be sure exactly what is responsible for the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. This can perhaps best be summarized by this segment of the Coast Guard's report. Quote, "In the absence of more definite information concerning the nature and extent of the difficulties reported and of problems other than those which were reported, and in the absence of any survivors or witnesses, the proximate cause of the loss of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald cannot be determined." It seems likely that the sinking of the ship was caused by a number of contributing factors, including accumulated wear and tear on the ship and ultimately the ferocity of the storm. The exact cause may never be known, but what we can know for certain is that on the night of November 10th, 1975, 29 souls lost their lives on Lake Superior. In their final report on the Fitzgerald sinking, the Coast Guard investigators made 15 recommendations for improvements to the rules and regulations for posterity. In addition, the NTSB, NOAA, and the American Bureau of Shipping each made their own recommendations. Over the next few years and even decades, a number of operating procedures were greatly altered and improved, some as a direct result of the disaster. In 1979, 8 real-time weather buoys were dispersed across Lake Superior, which gave accurate data on wind speed, direction, and wave heights. These numbers increased over the years until there were nearly 60 spread across all of the Great Lakes in 2019. After the disaster, it became more common for ships to be outfitted with emergency position-indicating radio beacons, which automatically broadcast accurate location data in the event of a disaster. This means that shipwreckage and potentially survivors can be brought to the attention of the Coast Guard immediately, and rescue efforts can commence quickly and more effectively, particularly in instances where the crew did not have time to send an emergency distress call, like the Fitzgerald. This was eventually mandated by Congress starting in 1988. In 1978, the Canadian Hydrographic Service conducted modern surveys of the area between Michipacotton and Caribou Islands to replace the old maps that dated back as far as 1916. The U.S. Coast Guard ended a regulation allowance that permitted ships to overfill their cargo holds in exchange for sitting lower in the water. This was tied in with many other broad safety improvements, including more frequent mandatory inspections of ships and their hatch and vent covers. Additionally, survival suits became mandatory on all Great Lakes freighters after the incident, which can protect crew members from hypothermia in the sometimes freezing water. Now, in the 21st century, ships are outfitted with automatic identification systems that automatically track their positions, which are also aided by GPS systems. While the Coast Guard's response time wouldn't have specifically aided the Edmund Fitzgerald since she sank so fast, this did lead them to greatly expand their rapid response fleets after this storm showed just how thin they could be stretched in an emergency. In addition, weather forecasting procedures have improved greatly in the last 50 years, meaning that modern ships can know with much greater clarity and early warning just what kind of weather they might be facing. With today's improved forecasting ability, the Edmund Fitzgerald might not have even left the safety of her dock to begin with that day. The day after the Fitzgerald was lost, the Mariners' Church rang her bell 29 times, one for each sailor lost in the disaster. That would become an annual tradition at the church, but it was expanded in 2006 to 30 rings to commemorate all of the lives ever lost on the Great Lakes. In 1995, a diving expedition to the Fitzgerald was conducted to recover her bell. An exact replica was left behind on the ship, bearing the names of all 29 who perished in the wreck. The bell was entrusted to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historic Society by the surviving family of the crew members, and it resides in their museum to this day. In August of 1976, Gordon Lightfoot's album Summertime Dream was released, featuring The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald as its second single. Given its somber tone and tragic subject matter, it was a song you would hardly expect to have a breakout success. Despite all of those factors, or perhaps even because of them, the song was a smash hit, reaching #1 in Canada and #2 on the US Billboard charts. Given the real tragedy that inspired it, Lightfoot was plagued by doubt during the writing process. He studied the available reporting to make the details as accurate as possible, but he wanted to ensure that it wasn't seen as corny or as though he was trying to cash in on a tragedy. Instead, people of the time and for generations to come heard the truth and genuine feeling behind the song. The song would regularly be played in Lightfoot's concerts for the rest of his life until he passed away in 2023. That same year, the Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Service was expanded once more to 31 chimes, with the additional bell commemorating the passing of Gordon Lightfoot, the man who had given the Fitzgerald her most famous tribute. Between 1875 and 1975, it is estimated that over 6,000 ships were wrecked in the Great Lakes. While small vessels are still periodically lost, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the last large shipping vessel to sink in those waters. This video is dedicated to the 29 souls that lost their lives on the lake that day, as well as the countless others before and since then. Thank you very much for watching. If you're interested in learning more about the Edmund Fitzgerald or the other topics discussed in this video, I have all of my sources listed below for you to look through.